Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th webinar in the COVID-19 Ask the Experts webinar series. This webinar will address a specific process for comprehensive suicide prevention and intervention in a time of distance learning. I'm Stacey Kalmer-Skalski and I am NASP Director of Professional Policy and Practice, and I will be your moderator for this webinar today. So the Ask the Experts webinar series is a collection of recorded webinars that are posted on the NASP's website that are designed to offer support to school psychologists and interns and practicum students as they navigate the delivery of school psych services during the pandemic. Each webinar is free and open to the public. We encourage you to share them with others. At the conclusion of every webinar, a discussion thread will be opened on the NASP Members Exchange, and as a follow-up to this webinar, you as a NASP member can actually post questions and begin a discussion about anything you've heard on this webinar that you think would be important to share with others. You can also ask questions of our expert presenters and other people in the field who are experts in this area. Each webinar will address critical questions emerging as a result of the need to provide virtual telehealth services. They will provide advice and guidance from our experts, and they'll offer suggested strategies and resources for addressing professional practice issues that you may encounter. Today's presenters are Dr. Stephen Brock. Steve is a professor of school psychology and the school psychology program coordinator at California State University in Sacramento. He is a nationally certified school psychologist. Steve worked for 18 years as a school psychologist before joining the CSUS faculty. As a school psychologist, he's helped to develop the district school crisis response protocol, specialized in functional assessment, and was on the autism specialty team. Steve is a member of NASP School Safety and Crisis Response Committee, chair of the Nominations and Elections Committee, and a past president of NASP. Yay! He is the lead author of School Crisis Prevention and Intervention, the Prepare Model. Welcome, Steve. We also have the ever so wonderful Mr. Rich Lieberman. Rich is a lecturer in the Graduate School of Education at Loyola Marymount University and a suicide prevention consultant for the Los Angeles County Office of Education. From 1986 to 2011, he coordinated the suicide prevention services for the Los Angeles Unified School District, which is the second largest school district in the United States. He has co-authored numerous book chapters on suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention in the schools. He's consulted nationally with districts experiencing suicide clusters, and he served on the steering committee for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. He is also a contributor to the SAMHSA Preventing Suicide program, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center's After a Suicide Toolkit, and the California Department of Education's Model Use Suicide Prevention Policy. Welcome, Rich. So, if we can then begin today, I would love it if you all could tell us a little bit about what's important to know and be able to do as a school psychologist if we are worried about one of our students who's potentially struggling with suicide thoughts. And Steve, maybe you could begin for us.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Stacey. In this webinar, we hope to bring to your attention and better explain some work conducted by the School Safety and Crisis Response Committee. Within that committee, we have a subgroup which also includes Melinda Cruz and Rob Coad, who along with Rich and I helped to develop a couple of documents that are specifically relevant to suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. Today, we'll be sharing with you our thoughts on a couple of checklists we've developed. The first one is a one-pager, and it discusses how to prepare for suicide intervention in a distance learning environment. I will be talking about that first. Then Rich will come in and he'll talk about actually conducting suicide intervention, again, with special reference to its delivery in a virtual or distance learning environment. Next slide. Now, both of these documents have as their foundation a much longer and more in-depth supporting document titled Comprehensive School Suicide Prevention in a Time of Distance Learning. It's actually, I think, running 6 pages long. And one of the things that generated this webinar and the 2 checklists that we're going to develop, that we're going to share with you here today, is the fact that they were long. And we felt, especially when it came to intervention, we needed a more concise, to the point set of documents that conveyed the basics of suicide intervention. The main elements of this supporting document are summarized on this slide. As you can see, we talk a little bit about basic assumptions, some conversation about virtual service delivery platforms, telehealth considerations, and then we talk about both the challenges and the opportunities of conducting suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention in a distance learning environment, and essentially using telehealth to provide these services. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned, I will review the first checklist, which speaks primarily to critical tasks we suggest school psychologists should engage in as they get ready to conduct suicide intervention remotely. First on our checklist is review your existing protocols. Hopefully you're not starting from scratch. Ideally, when you were working in a brick and mortar school, you had suicide intervention protocols and procedures in place. And basically what we're going to suggest you do is you modify those existing procedures to be able to deliver them via telehealth. For example, how to connect with students, secure student safety remotely, secure supervision, how to contact and consult with caregivers. Next slide.
Before you leave there, I just wanted to say that
Sure.
this really underscores the need to create a district suicide prevention task force, an in-house task force with administration, mental health, law enforcement, and particularly at this time when you're developing new policies and procedures, to have your district council as part of that, who's unique to virtual suicide prevention. Having a task force is going to last longer. So sustainability is the point here, so that you have this task force in place for after the crisis passes.
Yeah, excellent point, Rich. And to that, I would just add, we're not expecting that you do this in isolation. And I think that will become more apparent as we review these checklists. The idea that this is a collaborative venture that necessarily includes multiple parties. Next slide. Okay, item 2 on the checklist is basically documenting resources that you would be using to respond to a student who might be suicidal. You may already have a list like this. As you can see, might include law enforcement, a mobile crisis response team if one's available in your region, child protective services, and then there may be others that you and your colleagues feel are important to document and make available to all potential suicide interveners as they respond to the challenge of suicidal ideation and behavior remotely. Item 3 on the checklist is to review with staff members risk factors and warning signs associated with suicide. And here we would especially want to emphasize the need to emphasize with your colleagues how the current pandemic can affect suicide risk. Of course, one of the reasons for us developing these documents is our realization that the isolation, at least the perception of isolation generated by physical distancing requirements, is likely to increase suicidality among our students. Do you have something there, Rich?
Yes, and you went off on another great point in terms of, how the pandemic is exacerbating risk factors, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, but we have seen already marked increases in substance abuse and domestic violence. So when such a pandemic hits economically, and people are moved to like the more basic needs of life, their shelter, their food, their comfort. It's really difficult to, go on to the higher of the needs like academic achievement and things like that. I did want to say
good point.
also that this is great for the fall when returning to school to do this form of training with staff.
Yeah, and arguably it will be more important because if, as appears to be anticipated, we are headed into a significant economic recession, we can expect increased suicide rates. In fact, from 2007 on, up until really the most recent reporting years, we've had, and that was obviously the onset of the last so-called Great Recession, we've seen pretty steady, gradual increases in suicide rates, suicide death rates among all age groups and populations, but our target population of teenagers in particular. Next slide.
And I'd also mention within the age group of our staff as well, that since that time, we saw a spiking in that age group 35 to 55 as well. That involves staff and parents.
Yep, exactly. Number 4, review with staff members procedures to follow when suicidal behavior is judged to be imminent. So unlike a brick and mortar school building, the teacher won't be able to call the principal or call someone like you and say, hey, I have a student who I'm concerned about. They're going to be somewhere else physically. And so you need to consider exactly what the protocol is you're going to be advising teachers to do if during a virtual class meeting they identify suicidality, or even later after a class meeting, say when an English teacher is reading a journal entry, they identify suicidality. Is it a 911 call, request a wellness check? I'm kind of anticipating we may need to do that more than we might do when a kid was in a brick and mortar school building. Because in the traditional environment, we can check in on the kid, and sometimes we don't need a 911 call, and of course we don't make one. But I'm kind of thinking, and this will be up to you and your school to figure out, you might want to err on the side of caution, and we might find ourselves making these calls a little bit more frequently than we did in the past. Item 5 on the checklist is to review whatever suicide risk assessment procedures you develop, and most importantly, any modifications you judge to be necessary by the distance learning environment. Just as is the case in a brick and mortar school, in the virtual learning environment, school staff need to understand how to quickly access support for and refer at-risk students when providing distance learning activities. Next slide. Item 6, develop your telehealth skills. I know this is new for a lot of us, although I would imagine that by now a lot of you are a lot more skilled in telehealth than you ever thought you might be. But I do think it is important we continue to develop those skills. So in this part of the checklist, there's just places for you to document the telehealth skill activities you and your colleagues have engaged in so as to better be able to provide these services. Also part of item 6 is identifying district technology assistance resources. We're probably all using platforms that maybe we didn't use a lot before, and so being able to quickly access technical assistance for the use of these resources is very important. Item 7, develop your telehealth communication options. Now, those options and the requirements for use of telehealth resources have been loosened up somewhat given the challenges put forward by COVID-19, but we do want to make sure we carefully consider what option or options we're going to use in our school district. One thing to consider as we do that is, what about the service provider's personal devices? Are you going to use your smartphone or your personal tablet? And if so, how are we going to make sure that your privacy is protected? And then what about communication options for students without the internet? In one of my local school districts, for example, one of my bigger K-12 urban school districts, they literally provided every single student in their school district with Chromebooks, which, by the way, had the, what's it called, Rich, the GoGuardian software? Yeah, okay, the GoGuardian software that also allows them to know immediately if one of their students is doing a search that might involve the word suicide. In addition to making sure we're attentive to the so-called digital divide and make sure kids have the devices and the internet connections, we need to consider communication options for homeless students as well. By the way, one creative solution that I heard one school district in Arizona doing was they turned their school buses into hotspots. And for districts that didn't have, or regions within their district that didn't have wireless internet connections, because the Chromebook's not going to do any good if you don't have an internet connection, right? So they drove their buses to certain regions of the community where internet connectivity wasn't as prevalent, and allowed the community to use those buses as hotspots. Next slide. Item 8 is identify the telehealth communication platforms that you are going to use. You want to list the primary platform, maybe some secondary platforms, and then consider what you're going to do if for whatever reason telehealth turns out not to be practical. Item 9, identify individuals as responsible for conducting suicide intervention. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Identified individuals as responsible for conducting suicide intervention must have access to current and updated student demographic data. You know, when I'm working in a brick and mortar school building and I want to make sure I can quickly contact a caregiver, I walk to the office. I ask my secretary for the alphabetical list of all the students in my school, which he or she updates regularly, and I have the current contact information. Now that we're in remote environments, we need to make sure that just as the school secretary or the front office would have that current list, those individuals who potentially might be doing suicide intervention need to have quick and ready access to that current demographic information as well. Next slide. Item 10, individuals identified as responsible for conducting suicide intervention also need to have access to school and community crisis resources for immediate consultation. I'd really like to emphasize that the school-employed mental health professional never should perceive themselves as being on an island all by themselves when they're addressing the problem of suicidal ideation and behavior within a student. Quite simply, educators and school-employed mental health professionals are not 24/7 resources. Given that reality and the fact that suicide is a 24/7 concern, we necessarily have to have really clearly articulated and ongoing connections with these resources. And by immediate consultation, I mean almost in real time as you're conducting the suicide intervention, having those connections in community mental health. Oftentimes they're the places where the suicidal student would be brought. Having those connections that you can call, they know who you are, they are willing to consult with you almost immediately about a particular student who is presenting with some degree of suicidal ideation. Next slide. And these are the last two items on the preparing to provide intervention checklist. Number 11, develop consent procedures. Now, consent, when kids are at home, potentially with parents, it's going to be a little bit different than consent when they're in a brick and mortar school building. And as you can see, what we would hope these consent procedures would do is describe telehealth service delivery and specify technical considerations, explain how we provide telehealth, and discuss limitations, delineate what we expect of the students and the responsibilities of you and all parties involved in the intervention, identifies emergency contacts, and specifies multiple communication options. Finally, obtains consent for specific service providers to provide the telehealth service. Finally, we do recommend that these relatively new consent procedures be reviewed by your district's legal counsel to ensure compliance with state and federal regulations. It does vary somewhat from state to state, so you're going to want to have your lawyer check it out to make sure your form, whatever you're using, is in compliance with regulations. Now, when we're doing this in the brick and mortar school building and a kid's in crisis, it's ethically appropriate for us to intervene immediately and, for example, to do the suicide intervention immediately before we consult with parents. And then as soon as possible to get that, what for me is the primary 24/7 caregiving resource of the child's primary caregivers involved. And that gets me to step 12, determine the protocol for what we do if the caregiver is not available. The student's at home alone. How are we going to respond in that case? And again, identify that protocol and have it reviewed by legal counsel. All righty. So that's it for the preparing checklist. Next slide. I think you're on next, Rich.
I think I am.
Very good.
So thank you. I also want to thank our co-contributors, Melinda Cruz and Rob Coad, who we shamelessly pushed aside to be here today. But thanks to them, this was definitely a team project. As my partner would say, as we're taking a look at this checklist, one size does not fit all. So our wish is that you use this as a template for your task force to adopt the policies and procedures to distance learning for your school district. As we turn to intervention, the guiding tenets are always collaboration and supervision. So collaboration for you, the school psychologist, and Steve and I are both trainers, and we're both concerned about our students that are doing, telehealth, so that we assure that they have collaboration and they have supervision in that case. But here we talk about the supervision of the student. Now we have to assure a virtual circle of care around the student. So supervision is a concern from the very beginning of the intervention process. We always view intervention through two lenses. So there's a developmental lens. How do we learn skills with elementary school kids who may be on the other side of the divide and not have the knowledge of telecommunications, or squirrely and moving out of sight, difficult to conduct those interviews, versus the challenges of working with adolescents, which, it's kind of easy and creates a lot of anxiety if an adolescent just clicks off and disappears. So we also have to look through a cultural lens to make sure that we're providing the information and all the materials for parents in languages and that are appropriate to address the developmental level of their child. So before you contact the student, it's best, as you can see from the slide here, to have complete and redundant contact information for the primary caregiver. You see, we need to know their physical location, get their cell phone number so we can call, we can text, email address as well. That last slide that Steve covered infers a lot of planning to be done. Okay, on to the next slide. When the referral originates with the parent in this unique situation, we're going to contact to obtain informed consent. As you can see, if a parent needs immediate guidance and supervision for emergency services, we're there to facilitate that. The next three items on our list are going to require planning and the need to create procedures for when permission is given to conduct the risk assessment, when the parent says, no, you do not have the permission, what immediate actions you're going to take, or for the situation that Steve mentioned, when intervention procedures, when the parent has not become available to provide that consent. And the last point in terms of once again, making immediate recommendations for student care and supervision. Next slide. So here is where we address, you could see on the document, a large section for risk factors and warning signs as you prepare to contact the student, which is in the next step. Here's our thing on risk factors and warning signs. There are no predictors to youth suicide. I mean, the best predictor of future behavior we have is past behavior, which you'll see we have a specific train of questions during the assessment. But there are no predictors. There is no one cause. So we have to be vigilant even with kids of low risk, because there is no way to really know which kid, low, moderate, or high risk, is going to be propelled down this self-destructive path. We look at risk factors as coming together in a perfect storm. Look at Main Street in the town you live in. There are 8 lights on this Main Street. And for a kid to go from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide, all those lights have to turn green in a perfect storm. So here is the bad news, is that in certain circumstances, that trip can take all of 4 minutes, particularly if there is a firearm present in the household. So that the care and learning about firearm safety, means matter, is extremely important, raises risk extremely. So 2 factors come together to propel kids down this self-destructive path. A chronic factor, which we know to be underlying mental health, student depression, alcohol and substance abuse. But they are ignited by precipitating events, sometimes very common precipitating events like a loss of romance, some serious trauma, a loss of death by suicide, or exposure to suicide, or an academic crisis, or bullying. That can raise risk. So now as you look through these sections, the warning signs, a result of the consensus warning signs, you can see the link to the save.org website. Now in step 4, we contact the student. So as you conduct the interview, just most importantly, to get the student's exact address. And in the last one, having actions if the student does not provide assent to be assessed at that moment. Next slide. So the first step is to assess the student for risks. Now, these questions were never meant to be asked serially. They were never meant for you to ask all of these questions. However, you know, the best practice for intervention is we need to obtain a measure on current thoughts, current plan, and previous behaviors. So as you can see, immediately, if it is necessary to contact emergency psychiatric mobile services or 911, the police, immediately, do not hesitate. However, let's go through the questions for you to obtain those 3 measures. On the next slide, we can see that we definitely use, on the next slide, more direct questions. Got to that, Stacy. We definitely use, best practice to use very clear wording. The wording and much of the information from the questions have been provided by district-approved screening tools, such as the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. We have an app for that with the SAMHSA Suicide Safe mobile app to assist with assessment. I have preferred to use the Columbia for a number of reasons. They have a short form and a long form. I like to train on the long form because it gets you thinking about protective factors and troublesome behaviors in the past. But I like to assess with the short form because we do not have the luxury of long assessment time. So we complete the assessment. Next step on the next slide would be to move on and talk to the primary caregiver, the parent, as well as the teacher. Extremely important information can be verified through the parent, especially for a teacher. And I spent many years answering the hotline in LAUSD. And when a teacher would say to me, this change in behavior is not like this child at all, then that would jump out at a hotline operator. So abrupt changes in behavior. when parents report information about recent history of loss or trauma or bullying, particularly cyberbullying. I think we're going to see an increase of that during this period when kids have been isolated from meeting in groups. So we can also, from the parent interview, get an estimate of the circle of care that surrounds that student. So moving on, we are determining the level of risk, low, moderate, or high risk. When I had thousands and thousands of school staff in LAUSD to provide steps for each of these level of risk seemed redundant and too much. So we generally had procedures for low and moderate to high risk kids. When kids are at low risk, a critical part of intervention will be developing school safety plans and individual safety plans. And I really am appreciative of the fact that now we have apps to help us with safety planning. Stephen?
Yeah, Rich, I just wanted to validate your point about maybe not being as fine-grained in terms of low, moderate, and high risk, especially in the distance learning environment. Low risk, the bottom line here is it's the person, it's the student with thoughts of suicide, but there's no plan, probably no prior behavior, and they're saying, yeah, there's somebody I can talk to about this. That is low risk. Moderate or high risk in the distance learning environment, it's going to be hard to make those distinctions, so you very well may want to treat them the same. Also, I just wanted to add that on the checklist itself, that little gray shaded area in the form, which if you're looking at right now, looks a lot clearer. There's a spot, this is a PDF fillable document, so you could actually type in your plan, but beneath it, you'll see a series of boxes to check. It is not meant to be all-inclusive. It's just, these are just things that Melinda, Rob, Rich, and I thought were common elements of plans designed to keep kids safe and would be part of a specific suicide intervention. It's not intended to be overly prescriptive. Thanks, Rich.
Excellent points. And yes, the distinction between moderate and high risk, generally we had our behaviors down to, have you thought about it? Have you tried it? Do you have a plan to do it today? I also want to mention, once again, some of the helpful apps that we have had. Apps like the virtual Hope Box, or the one that was kind of organized here in California, My3, MY with the number 3, and A Friend Asks from the Jason Foundation. Very helpful, and I believe those resources are in the article. So on the next slide, we see developing the action plan with the parents.
Rich,
sorry, go ahead.
You just mentioned the other article, so that was what Rich is referring to, where you could get more about My3 and these other apps. In the longer 6-page document, you will find links to the resources that Rich was just mentioning, and that's what he was referring to. Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, I think we all agreed that while we had a basis for telehealth in the age of distance learning, that we really needed these form of checklists to be kind of short and sweet and make point and reference points to the critical information. So as you see, we're sharing with the parent the follow-up actions, making the appropriate referrals. We can share with the parent the elements of the school safety plan. And if the child is moderate or high risk, specify a specific caregiver plan with the appropriate referrals, the numbers to call if they need immediate emergency response. Number 9, always, always, always collaborate. That is our advice for the school psychologist, the school employed mental health professional. I always like to drag 2 other people in with me, one absolutely being one of the administrators, the principal, or the administrative designee that works with you on these referrals. And I also want to stress that don't worry about the documentation. I would always have a principal say, oh, I have the student in front of me. He's answered question 15, but where do I put the answer to the question? I would say, put the question away, put it in the drawer next to you, turn your attention to the student, right? Have all of this preparation, but try to be 100% with the student and your observations. I've noticed in doing the Zoom classes with my students, it's a little window into their lives. But always worry about the documentation later. And as we end on one of the last steps of the intervention component, which is reentry planning. We actually have two kinds of reentry planning now. When parents need action plans for when there's a child returns from hospitalization, the resources necessary. And I think number one on that checklist, the consent for confidential information, getting the appropriate releases of information form signed are so critical so that we can get that information immediately. And also the aspect of reentry when kids are going to come back to school. How do we identify the trusted adults at school, the trusted peers, the resources, how they can ask for help? And I think one of the programs that I really loved in presenting with my positive behavioral interventions and support folks is the check-in, check-out, so that these kids have adults to check in at the beginning of their day and checking out at the end of their day. With that, I'll turn it back over.
Okay, wow, it's excellent information. I do have a couple follow-up questions that I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to start with Rich. Rich, you mentioned the importance of collaboration and really engaging, critical people in this process of trying to provide comprehensive intervention supports for kids. You mentioned also a suicide task force at the beginning. I'm wondering if you could just go back and review for us a little bit about who might be the most important people to include in a suicide task force, and a little bit more about how that collaboration might look between community-based providers and our school-based providers. And of those, you've mentioned the school administrator and the teacher as critical players, but I'm wondering about other people in the school that might also be engaged in this. So could you just take a second and kind of run through that again for us?
I sure will, because I think it's really important. This is the part that builds sustainability and builds capacity in districts, because this task force would definitely outlive the current crisis. And there's so much need for it. In terms of who should be on it, my goal is I have to take a look at the size of the district I'm working with, because in many, many, many districts, it is absolutely possible to take the designated school-employed mental health professional that is going to be doing the assessments at each of those schools and put those on the task force so they are all in concert, because they all need to know what are the latest advances, what are the district policies, and they need to be available 24/7, because we don't want to have our school psychologist on Tuesday being called by their Wednesday school that they have to come over. We have to build compliance, sustainability, capacity, even at the school, at the individual school level. So that'll always begin with administrators at the district level, as well as administrators at the school level. So, but it is a district-wide, in-house task force. We don't add community until we take it to the next step of, which is absolutely necessary when responding to a cluster in the community. The misunderstanding is that this cluster is a school problem, when in fact it is a deep community problem, and we have to bring not only the local players for suicide prevention into one room, but we have to put them in connection with the statewide and national-wide efforts that exist, because some of those resources, like the Lifeline, like Trevor Line, like Text Line, are really valuable national resources.
Okay. Thank you for that. Steve,
I do have
a
another
thought.
22 minutes, but
Oh,
yes,
thank you. I'll make sure we use it all up, Rich. So, Steve, I wanted to follow up with something you mentioned. You were talking about the school district locally near you and the fact that they're using the GoGuardian suicide software. This is, of course, a sort of growing thing that a lot of school districts are buying into, where they have software scanning kids' documents, looking for risk-based comments and things like that. I'm wondering if you could just offer a little bit of advice to some folks about the types of policies and procedures that really are best implemented in a district or crafted in a district that decides to use something like this, and how that might, in a telehealth environment, also be important to consider.
Right. Well, just in general, that's an important question, and we could go on and on and on about it, but I need to save a lot of time for Rich. So I won't do that. And instead, I will offer one primary consideration. You need to verify that there is someone 24/7 available to take reports. So if at 2 a.m. a student is going on their Chromebook and they're searching for suicide methods, that message is going to go to somebody, and that somebody needs to be a 24/7 resource. Now, in the district I was consulting with, it was a district level administrator, and bless his heart, he was willing to do that. That may not always be the case. So that I would just argue that there's a lot to your question, Stacy, but the one that I would really want to highlight is, if you're going to have software like that, and you're going to be it's going to be capturing kids who might be a danger to self or others, it needs to go someone that's going to be ready, willing, and able to respond 24/7.
Okay. Thanks, Steve, for that. Rich, did you have something else to add to that?
Well, that's absolutely the thing. Be careful what you ask for, correct? Because as someone who was that 24/7, I will say it is effective that if you know one person to call, my whole reputation was I called people back, right? Which is like so important when you're in crisis. And, we'll get through the crisis. But Steve's point is very well made.
Excellent. As we often do in The Wizard of Oz, we have somebody behind the scenes who's been listening in. NASP Director of Communications, Cathy Cowan, is also on the webinar today. And I'm going to ask Cathy to unmute herself. I noticed that she has a question that she'd like to share also. Cathy, can you unmute yourself? There we go.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Rich and Steve. In listening to you talk about this concept of reentry in this very unusual circumstance that we're in, I know there are a number of issues in general when a student might be re-entering the learning environment and the learning process after having been at risk for suicide. And I'm wondering how, in this case, how you might engage teachers, like who's engaged in the connection with that student when they're back in a more engaged process with the school. So if the student comes in, is back at home and they're okay, and they can go back to accessing classes and things like that, do you tell the teacher that does the teacher know that this student was at risk for suicide? Are there certain things that other staff will be engaging with this student? Now, I know we need to protect the student's privacy, but as you noted, Rich, you're seeing students in their homes in a different way than you would have in the classroom. So I'm wondering how you handle people that might not be on the crisis team, but might still be engaging with that student after the fact.
I always go back to the circle of care. So in building this virtual circle of care with the kids, this is also one reason why you collaborate. Who do we need to bring into this virtual circle of care to make sure. For example, when we did this in, I love the phrase, brick and mortar schools, you know, a kid would return. Sometimes in the typical reentry meeting is the parent brings the child in. That's your best hope. What usually happens is they slow the car to 30 and kick them out and tell them to go to school. But what happens in the first period class is really important. Should we tell that first period teacher? The first kind of parental response would be, no, I want to keep everything confidential. But you know, every kid in that class knows because they're in the virtual world and they've been texting all weekend where that student has been. So I think we need to bring people, we need to talk about it more. I'm not saying go on the microphone, let's not click reply all, but we certainly want to bring in some very relevant, trusted adults into this circle of care.
Yeah, I would concur, Rich. And I would add that I think this might be one of the opportunities of our current distance learning environment, in that we are literally being forced to be more collaborative. Back in the day, what was that, 2 months ago, when kids were in school, you know, we had more physical control over it, at least for 6 hours during the day. That physical control is gone. And it necessarily results in us needing to be more collaborative. And it is my hope that by being forced to be more collaborative, we can take that into a return to school, which will happen, gang. We will get back to the brick and mortar school building at some point. And when we do, I hope we've learned lots of valuable lessons. And this might very well be one of the more important lessons, at least in relation to addressing suicidal ideation and behavior among our students. We can't go it alone. We have to be collaborative. And we are, in fact, being forced to be even more collaborative in the distance learning environment.
Great.
Can I ask
Thank
a
you, guys.
follow-up question quickly?
Yeah, go ahead, Cathy.
Thanks. So I wonder then, is, you know, I'm thinking I have on my parent hat here. What, if you have any recommendations, and maybe it's not different, about also maybe collaborating with differently with, if the student is lucky enough to have a private clinician who's helping them through this process, how that, if there are ways and opportunities in this virtual world to collaborate even more effectively potentially with that other important person in that child's or that student's circle of care. If you have any guidance on that, because that can be hard.
Yeah, that is and always has been an important element of reentry, and on the checklist that we developed, it continues to be there. That kind of collaboration with the mental health care providers is absolutely essential, and it needs to be really, really clear, explicit, and ongoing. And without that, a reentry plan is going to be flawed, because that is essentially then forcing the school to go it alone, which I'm advocating for we avoid. We don't go it alone. We're not 24/7 resources. Suicidal ideation is a 24/7 concern, and those community-based mental health resources combined with primary caregivers really completes that circle of care that Rich is referring to. We're part of it, but it's more than just that.
And I would add to that excellent point, in that circle of care, very often we have situations where the therapy is done in the community, where the doctor is writing the medication, and we all know that the vast majority of our kids on antidepressant medication are not really getting that through child psychiatrists. So they're getting there through their primary caregivers. And what we need to do is tighten the circle of care so we're noticing whether the dosage and the medication is being effective. So we need to, wouldn't it be really important if the first period teacher would be able to report in a Zoom conference that while talking to him at 10 o'clock in the morning, he was falling asleep. See, that's where also people can't hide from meetings with Zoom meetings, right? I mean, you can turn off, but if the face is right there on the screen, you can actually bring all of these professionals into the room for a very brief meeting. It's almost the way of life. Everybody is learning during these times. Maybe this will be a learning curve we'll take back when everybody's back in brick and mortar schools. Everybody will be able to Zoom.
Thanks. Thank you guys for those responses. I've got one final question I want to ask before we wrap everything up. And this gets back to something that you said earlier, Rich, about documentation. I really appreciated your comment about that. When you're in the moment with the kid, you need to stay in the moment with the kid and really focus on the child and not whether or not every box is checked and every piece of paper is sorted properly. But there does come a time, having been a former school administrator, where you do have to kind of look at what type of documentation you have, where it's stored, and how it can be used. And I'm wondering if you just could take a minute and talk just a little bit about how this checklist fits, how these checklists fit into that process, and how that helps inform the next steps then for kids in schools too.
Well, at the very beginning, the whole goal of the documentation was simply on Tuesday the child said this, and on Tuesday I did this, so that there was a documentation, a course of action. It's a district question that has to be answered. We determined that we only wanted one form to go along with the program, so that callers would never be looking for the form that they could never, where is this form kept versus where this form? So we made it very simple, and it started out with a triplicate form, if you can believe it, at one of the, during those times, where the documentation can actually follow. It's so important for documentation to follow the student in multiple locations in the school district. You don't want a kid who was high risk in 5th grade, before we broke, now going on to a new school next year, and there hasn't been any communication. So there are now, in the old days when we had a golden rod and a white form and the pink would follow the child throughout the school district. There was a central record. Now it can all be done with the central computer skills. But the name of the form was the Risk Assessment Referral Document, which we commonly called the RARD. By the time 1 year was up, we had a new disorder, a DSM-3, RARD anxiety disorder, the RAD. Okay? People were way too concerned about the documentation while they were doing the assessment. So I can't thank you for helping stress the point. Be here now.
Yeah.
And get here later with the documentation.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. So as we wrap up today, I want to just remind everybody that the NASP does have these checklists available to you as fillable forms on the NASP website. And the links are contained here in your slides. The slides from this presentation will be available on the NASP website, also in the Ask the Experts series location. So you want to make sure you go on there and click on those. We do have other documents and other resources that are also important to your telehealth services being delivered during the pandemic. And we encourage you to go online and look at all of those different documents and resources and dig through them and sort of see which things actually work the best for you. There is, at a time like this, it's really important that you don't just get one thing and try and make one thing fit in your world. It's important to review as many things as you can and then find the things that match your settings the best. So with that in mind, I want to just say thank you to our speakers today and to the wizard behind the curtain for joining us also, Cathy Cowan. And I want to thank all of you for listening to this webinar, and I wish you all a safe and healthy weeks ahead until we can return to school and back to normal. Good luck to everyone.